Good afternoon. It is May 23rd, 2019. My name is Katie Schank, and today I'm here with Tim Cairl to conduct an interview for the two-party Georgia Oral History Project, sponsored by the Richard B. Russell Library at the University of Georgia. Mr. Cairl has worked on multiple political campaigns as consultant to Valerie Wilson in her run for state school superintendent, as field director and volunteer coordinator for Kyle Williams in his run for state senate, as a field director for Jason Carter in his run for state senate. In addition, he served as a legislative aide to State Representative Simone Bell. In terms of political organizations, Mr. Cairl is the former state executive director of the Young Democrats of Georgia, and he served in that position from 2006 to 2009. He currently serves as the chair on the board of directors for the Georgia Stonewall Democrats, and he's employed by the Metro Atlanta Chamber of Commerce as the director of education policy. Mr. Cairl, I'm excited to speak with you today, and I look forward to a discussion about the role of activism in Georgia politics, the importance of supporting candidates who support LGBT rights, and what you might see as the future of Georgia politics. So let's get started on expanding this historical narrative. And first, let's just start with some biographical information. Tell us about yourself, your parents, where you were born, where you went to school.
Great. Thanks, Katie. I really appreciate you doing this. I was originally born in Michigan, central Michigan, tiny little rural farming community called Vestaburg. Lived there until my 15th birthday. And my parents, like many from the upper Midwest and Northeast, decided to move south for work, for job. And I came with them. So I finished high school here in Douglasville, Georgia. My parents have kind of had a number of different professions. My dad was originally in farm implements, so he supplied farmers with all of their equipment for a lot of different, everything from tractors to backhoes to you name it.
Did he continue that when you moved to Georgia?
He did not.
Okay.
He moved into a different line, so he worked for a company called Rhetoric here, which is, if you've ever driven by a large construction site and you see those really oversized vehicles like dump trucks and grinders that are just massive machines, he ran the warehouse that supplied those. So same type of business, just not for farming. My mom was mostly administrative work. She retired a little early. My father retired actually about 10 years ago now. So yeah, they're both here. My entire immediate family is now all in the South, mostly in Georgia. I have one sister that's in Arkansas.
The outlier.
Yes. So I was here to finish high school, lived in Southwest Virginia for about 4.5 years for college, and then back to Atlanta for work.
Okay. And where was it that you went to college?
Went to Liberty University,
okay.
Lynchburg, Virginia.
And what did you study there?
I started in secondary education. Thought I wanted to be a high school teacher, and then moved into health sciences ed, which is not classroom based. That's much more wellness, first aid, pre-med, early nursing. That was my line of study. That was where my interest and heart lay.
Okay.
I was really good at education. was not my interest.
Well, that's interesting. So that is pretty far away from the work that you do now. So when did you first become politically active?
So I was actually active in Douglasville. So when we moved to Georgia, my parents and I went to a church, a Baptist church in Douglasville, and we had campaigns that would come and recruit volunteers from the church. So there were a couple of Republican lawmakers that were running statewide that came and recruited young people to come phone bank and walk with them in parades and whatever they needed help with. So I was one of those people that said, hey, I'm not doing anything this Saturday. Why don't I go phone bank? I had no idea what a phone bank was.
Okay.
So that was actually how I started. I wouldn't say I was passionate about it. It was more like my friends are doing it, so I'll go along with it. And that was basically my political activism all the way into college.
Okay.
Was much more on the conservative side.
And because Liberty is a conservative university.
Conservative,
okay.
Yes. If you're not familiar, it is started by Jerry Falwell and his family in Lynchburg, Virginia. And my last campaign that I worked on the conservative side was George Allen for governor in Virginia. many
Okay.
years ago.
Okay.
And that was actually the first time when I think I was moving away from my friends are all doing it to me questioning myself, why am I doing this? Because
Okay.
I'm not really understanding what I'm saying here to these people door to door or on the phone. And I'm not sure I really follow this line of thinking. I wasn't really, it became a same idea. Somebody recruited me out of a class and said, hey, why don't you join us on Saturday? And I said, sure, why not? But as I was having to learn scripts and things, you know, as you get older, I think you start to question more of these kind of things.
Sure, the critical analysis of what's going on.
Exactly, that was exactly it. And I just decided I didn't really want to do that anymore. I didn't really believe these things I was telling people about the great George Allen and why he would make such a great governor of Virginia. So I decided to take a break.
Okay.
And for many years, I didn't really do anything in politics. Was always interested in it. I would read about it, follow it, would subscribe, to news stories and that kind of thing, but was not personally active. So after I took that little break of several years, one of the stories and interests that I was following was about a governor from a northeastern state. This is about 2002, who helped to pass a civil unions bill in Vermont. Again, sort of fit with where I came from, a rural setting, a controversial decision at the time. Mm-hmm. But he stood by it, and then not only did he stand by it, he was talking publicly about it, was going to the Democratic National Convention talking about it, and sort of asking big questions at the time. So that really caught my interest. And when I also read a side story about him possibly running for president in 2004, I thought, well, wouldn't that be interesting? Sort of the first time someone is talking about these issues that I cared about personally on a national stage. And so at the time, there was a big internet website called meetup.com.
Okay.
And there were people that were signing up meetups for presidential candidates, and mine was Howard Dean from Vermont. And there was one that was for Atlanta, and it had, I think, 2 other people in it.
And you had moved back at this point.
I had moved back.
Okay.
In 1998. I moved back to Atlanta and and was working here.
Okay.
So this is now 2002, and I signed up and went to that meeting and met 2 other people who were just as excited as I was, and it just snowballed from there.
What you lacked in number, you had an enthusiasm.
We did. I think we went from 3 to 60 to 400 to we had to just keep creating more and more and more because we couldn't fit everybody in any venue that we could find.
Wow. And was this because you were supporters of Dean's entire platform, or was it particularly his support of civil unions? What was it?
It was a little bit of everything. I would say the initial was 2 things. It was his opposition to the war in Iraq and his support for civil unions. And the third one would be his stance on healthcare, sort of the universal healthcare model that at that time, we didn't really have a national conversation happening about national health care. Those 3 things, I think, brought the initial people to the table. And then as he got more and more popular nationally, it just kept growing. I think by June of 2004, our subscriber list was somewhere around 14,000 people in the state. So
wow.
Here I was, a political novice that went from being non-active in Democratic politics to now chairing a volunteer campaign committee for a presidential candidate with 14,000 subscribers. So it was a great group of people. I'm still friends with a lot of those people today. So that was my entree into Democratic politics. And at the same time all of this is happening, you also had the sort of demise of the then modern Democratic Party. You had the loss of the governorship in 2002 and the state Senate and then the state House in 2004. So it was kind of, you had 2 things happening at the same time, this rise in political activism and the decline of sort of the old Democratic machine.
Old guard.
Yeah.
So in all of this organizing you were doing, you're one of 3 that show up, and then suddenly you're in charge. Was it a lot of learning on the job? Did you have any formal training? Were the dean folks coming down and helping?
Yes to both. I was really lucky that some of the people that approached me and attached themselves, or I attached myself to them early, did have some experience in activism and politics. So I learned a lot from what they had done in other activism circles. And the Dean campaign realized they had a very large volunteer network. And they took advantage of that and the fact that they were doing trainings for their state directors, their state committees, all about how to self-organize and how to manage campaign events and how to participate in some of the national call-ins and all those other things that come with the presidential campaign.
And so was this around the time or after the campaign that you go back to graduate school, to the Andrew Young School of Public Policy? Where does that fit in the timeline?
So I got a taste for politics in that Dean campaign. And by taste for it, I mean the organizing side of it, and the sort of leading a table of people who are really passionate about what they do. Mm-hmm. And then realized what I was doing in my day-to-day work, I didn't have that same level of passion for. I was good at what I did, and I was in healthcare consulting at the time.
Okay.
And I loved what I was able to do as far as I was good at it, but my passion, my heart was not in it. And about the time that the Dean campaign was ending, I had an offer from a friend of mine to help her with the campaign. And so I made the jump. I said, if I'm going to do this, I'm going to do it while I'm young. And I still have a little bit of time to figure out if this is what I really want to do. Right. So I left healthcare consulting and went full time into campaigns, nonprofit, fundraising, management. That was my life from 2004 until 2009, and at the end of that period of time is when I was executive director of Young Democrats of Georgia. I was the full-time state employee. Okay. For Young Democrats of America. So I was the state director here. I had a small staff, and it was one of the best jobs I've ever had in my life.
Well, let's I feel like maybe this is going to jump a little bit, but let's talk more about that. So what are you doing as the state director for the Young Democrats at a time in a state where the Democrats have just lost a lot of their traction and hold?
Yeah, and it was very interesting because I think a lot of the sort of old Democratic Party had sort of divided itself into 2 camps. You had the party that was now part of the party that was now turning Republican and switching over to the Republican Party, some very publicly in some elected officials' case. And then you also had another, what they would call yellow dog Democrats, the ones who were never going to change because there was history and there was family and there was value all embedded in that. Mm-hmm. That other half, I think, entrenched themselves. So these are mostly older Democrats, a lot of older party activists that just sort of drew a line in the sand and said, we're not giving up. At that same time, you had young people who were getting very engaged. And this comes out of a lot of national factors. It comes from the war in Iraq. It comes from the 2006 kind of wave election that happened nationally. It comes mm-hmm. from the Obama nomination in 2007, 2008. Mm-hmm. So there were a lot of things happening that were driving young people to look for an outlet. At that same time, I'm taking over the helm of Young Democrats of Georgia in that staff role, and we had a couple of hotbeds of activism. Honestly, we had Young Democrats of Atlanta, which became very large and very active in campaigns, and then we had campuses where we had never had Young Democrats chapters ever. Okay, so that were coming out of the woodwork.
Charter organizations.
We went from, and I'm forgetting the initial number. It was somewhere around the high teens, low 20s. We went from that size of a very loose knit organization without staff person in 2005 to 2009, 52 chapters across the state. programs, chapters, regular quarterly retreats for all these students. So there was a programming that was happening. There was trying to upskill activism, trying to instill leadership, and so there was a formalization to it where there had been just a loose kind of social organization.
So, and I mean, I think sometimes people are very humble, right? So you're talking about there's this moment and there's a zeitgeist and people are ready and they're primed. But also, that doesn't just happen on its own. So, like, where does the wizardry come in? Like, how did you make that happen? That's impressive and an exponential growth.
There was a core group from Young Democrats. My exposure to it happened with a good friend of mine, two good friends of mine, Billy Joyner and Paige Gleason, both very involved in Young Democrats of Georgia at the same time I was. So this happened, in kind of informal conversations with the three of us and a lot of our friends in Young Democrats about what we really wanted. Like, what was the vision that we had for how, sort of left-leaning politics could come back in the Southeast, and what would that look like, and who should be at the table, and sort of all those big questions that a lot of times you don't have a chance to ask when you're, in your early start of political activism. So. Sure. I think we might have been at the leading edge of that conversation and just putting it into formal action. We happened to find a funder through Young Democrats of America that was willing to take a chance on a southern state, putting that type of program together. So we had a lot of good luck and a lot of smart people.
Okay, so what is it about? I mean, you were living in Georgia, your family was here, so that makes sense that you come back. But what is it about Georgia politics that really caught your interest? How did you know that this was the place that needed your expertise or your energy at that point in time?
I think I would say, there's one thing that drives me as a person, is that I'm a fixer. I don't like being just a caretaker of something that's already kind of working and rolling. And I think what draws a lot of political activists that are grown here in the South and want to stay and just embed themselves here is that there's a lot of work to do. There's a lot of opportunity and there's a lot of need and not a lot of resources. And so you really get to be inventive and innovative in how you attack activism like that. And it can be a little heartbreaking sometimes because you do feel like you're beating your head against a wall on some issues.
Right.
But I think long term, I think you would find more opportunity for a big needle change on political issues in the South, and particularly the Southeast, than you would in a lot of other areas of the country.
So let's talk a little bit more now in detail about the Stonewall Democrats and their mission and why the work that you do there and the organization does is so important.
Yeah. So there's a couple of things for context on that one, which is in 2004, we didn't have a Stonewall Democrats. And at the same time, we had a very contentious presidential election. We had the passage of a gay marriage ban in Georgia. And we were kind of struggling, I think, with LGBT equality in general. There was a lot of questions about, would we ever get to a spot where marriage was legal? It's passed in Massachusetts at this time, and other states are trying to figure out, why can't we have that? What are we doing? What are they doing that we aren't doing that would help us move the needle on this? Particularly on not just marriage equality, but on all LGBTQ issues. So there was a concerned group of us that had been active in politics, were in LGBT and allied communities, and we got together for a beer, literally, at Manuel's Tavern. And
it seems like all good political stories start at Manuel's.
Yeah, it's a great hotbed start for this kinds of conversations. We started talking about this, and Kyle Bailey was a young Democrat at the time. He started talking with a couple of LGBT funders that were active in the Atlanta LGBT community, and they said, well, it seems like we've got kind of two needs. We've got a statewide equality organizations that focus on big issues, and it stays nonpartisan as a 501c3 should. But there needs to be a guide, now that we have this kind of splitting of the Democratic Party, and you have a new wave of young activism, but you have an old guard that's still in place. We need someone to help us sort out who are the pro-LGBT allies and who are not. And that was really where Stonewall Democrats came in. And it was meant to focus on, it started as Atlanta Stonewall.
Okay.
And it was almost entirely city level focused. So it would only do state and local. And it was not meant to be a fundraising arm. We had an equality organization that was already great at that. Okay. It was really meant to be a guide for those of us who were, and I forget the time, I know it's gone higher now. At the time, I want to say in Georgia, trying to remember old poll numbers, are somewhere around 70 to 75% of LGBT folks over the age of 18 consider themselves Democrats. So when we're looking at that population, how are they to determine when they walk in a voting booth when they've got 7 Democrats in the primary to pick from, who are my allies and who are not? Okay. And that is really where the birth of this organization came from, was that driving question about, we want to support those that are fair-minded and that have LGBT and allied concerns in mind, and will take that into mind when they get into office.
So I think that's interesting to bring up, because as I was talking to people about coming to do this interview, they're like, well, we know about the log cabin Republicans, and that makes sense, but aren't Democrats supposed to be progressive? So I mean, stereotypes can both be, they're harmful all around, but the people have this impression that if you're a Democrat, you are therefore pro-LGBT rights and progressive, and so what would your message be to people?
I would say, by and large, now in 2019, that is absolutely the case. In 2004, 2005, that was not the case. Okay. And that there were a lot of questions, and you have to remember that this comes on the heels of a marriage ban that was passed with a Democratic majority in the state house. Right. And there were so many of us that were in that fight at the state capitol and lobbying, and we saw it go down the first time. It was defeated and then brought up again and passed. And so that is where this consternation about who is really with us and who is really not with us started to come in, and how that conversation at Manuals happened.
You realized you had to peel back the layers a little more. You couldn't just take at face value.
There was, and and if you extrapolate that marriage fight out into all the other issues that affect it, and you think about housing, for instance, so then you're down at the local level, and you get at city council level, that question also comes up, because there are some that are for fair housing and some that weren't for fair housing. And so it was sorting through those questions that we realized Stonewall had a niche. There's a need for that information to be in the hands of people when they walk in.
No one party, no group of people is a monolith, and you have to...
Right. Somebody has to help guide.
So are there any predecessors in Georgia to the Stonewall Democrats? I mean, you mentioned that there are some of the nonpartisan, but who are the organizations that Stonewall maybe look to say we want to do it kind of like that, or we definitely don't want to do that?
Yeah, at the time, there was a National Stonewall Democrats group. It was a very loose coalition of state and local Stonewall groups that were politically active, everywhere from Manhattan to San Francisco. So we had those groups to look at and to see kind of what they were doing and draw off of maybe some of the ideas that they were doing. In the state, we had kind of previous versions, sort of like pop-up versions, if you will. Okay. Think about like ACT UP in the 80s, where you had sort of these activism pieces that were very LGBT community centric, that had popped up here. So we had that to look on. In the 90s, when you had Cracker Barrel that was firing employees for being gay, there was another group, may have been Stonewall at the time. I'm blanking on what the name of that group is. But there was a group then that was doing the same type of activism. So we had that sort of institutional knowledge.
It was more like an ad hoc, though, like quick, we have to address this.
They were addressing sort
in
of
the moment.
one thing, one subject at the time that was very time dependent, and when that went away, the group went away.
Okay. Are you working in the Stonewall Democrats in partnership with other organizations that work for voters' rights in traditionally marginalized groups, and what does that relationship look like?
Yeah, and that's been one of the most fascinating things about working with Stonewall, is that it started with a very kind of niche focus, because it started off about marriage equality, and this comes on the heel of the marriage ban in 2004, so that made sense. As it went on, by the time we got to 2006, 2007, the issue started to broaden. So you've got housing, you've got trans rights, there was just a number of other things that we realized our group was really active in, either like one person on the board might be active in a particular area, and so they're educating us about it, or it's an area that we just realized no one else was pointing on, particularly on the Democratic side. That I always try to keep that in mind. Like, we're not talking about the grand electorate. We're talking about the slice of Democratic primary voters, and that we had a lot of work to do. So as we started looking at the work that we had to do, we started realizing we got to do this in coalition. There's no way that our small group of activists is going to do the big lift on this. We've got to have allies. We've got to have friends. In order for us to do that, that means that we've got to make that connection and then show up for their work.
Right.
So coalition work then started coming in 2006, 2007, 2008. So then it was, not only are we going to show up at pride marches and for Democratic candidate events, it might be Planned Parenthood that we're working on, like a singular issue, like fair housing or fair access to health care. It might be the Lesbian Health Initiative, which was at that time was focused on cancer care and group treatment, but they also did a whole lot of other community work that aligned with some of the things that we were interested in. So the coalition work just kept getting broader and broader. So that's why we're always very careful to say it is LGBT and allied. That allied piece is so big, because we're not, just like you talked about, a monolithic, like even the LGBT community isn't monolithic, and we're all affected by issues that happen in the community. So recognizing and pulling that all in together makes it that much more powerful.
Sure. Now, talking about all other issues, and this is something that's come up again and again in these interviews, purging of voters from the voter rolls, voter intimidation, voter suppression, and it's especially a concern for the African American, the Latino, the Asian American population. And obviously there is a crossover with some of those groups with the LGBT community. But I guess, do you see those same issues at the forefront of the work that you do when that identity isn't necessarily immediately apparent?
Yeah, because I think particularly voting rights issues, I'll use that as an example. No one should ever feel like their vote doesn't count. And however that feeling is expressed, whether it's personal, where they just feel defeated. And after 2004, we had a huge problem with this, getting the LGBT community back to the polls, realizing that they had just been walloped on that marriage ban. So how do you bring them back in to say, well, now in 2005, I need you to go vote in the city council election?
And they're like, give me a break.
Yeah, and so we had a lot of instances where that constant talking individually to people and linking arms with allied organizations made a huge difference. And I'll use one example. 2009, the mayoral election in Atlanta, when you had Kasim Reed and Mary Norwood. Stonewall took a huge political hit on that one.
Why is that?
Because we endorsed Kasim Reed, and Mary Norwood, to her credit, has always been very LGBT friendly, but she's also an avowed Republican, and so people would ask us, how could you do that? And it's we're a primary partisan organization. We don't back Republicans, we back Democrats.
Right.
And Kasim Reed was a known quantity at the time. He had been in the state Senate and state House, so we knew his voting record, and we had worked with him on the marriage ban. And so there was a known quantity there, and we took a chance, and we got so much pushback for it. But that election was 400 votes, so you had the difference between a mayor who eventually came around on LGBT marriage, or gay marriage and LGBT equality, versus what would have been, one of the few large cities in the Southeast held by a Republican office holder. So it was very much a different thing. But having done all of that engagement work from 2005 to 2009, we never would have been in that spot to help deliver votes in the 2009 election. So I'm not saying that we swung the election. I'm just saying with those close margins, it made our case about it is so important for every vote to show up. And that happens time and time again. It happens in a lot of state house races. It happens even in our last gubernatorial election, which was by a razor-thin margin.
Right.
So it's that constant engagement. It's talking about issues that matter to people. And then a lot of it's just making it personal. You have to ask. It is amazing how many candidates will do so much work going door to door, phone banking, and they never actually ask for the person's vote. They want to talk a lot, but they don't actually ask, and they don't actually listen. So I think as an organization, you've got to be really thoughtful about not just sort of yelling at people to go vote.
Right.
You've got to talk to them and then listen, and then try to figure out what is about your core organization that works with what that voter is looking for and needs. And it's not for everybody. Stonewall Dems is not for every LGBT voter. It's not.
Okay.
But if they're really interested in primary politics and sort of that center left and left politics and what drives that activism part of the party, there's definitely a home there.
So typically, who is the typical Stonewall Democrat then? When you say it's not for everyone, who is it for?
We're a little bit of everywhere, a little bit of everything. So the core group for Stonewall Dems are kind of your old season. I consider us old seasoned activists at this point. I feel like we have sort of been there and done that, and we've all worked in campaigns, volunteered in campaigns, donated, slogged flyers, marched. We've done it all.
Okay.
And then you've also got those that go back even way further than that were through kind of the tail of the civil rights period. Okay. So you've got
through the actual Stonewall riots.
Yeah, right, right. So you've got from that side to where kind of I am at this newer end, and then you've got even newer. You've got young kids in high school that are getting very politically active. So it's kind of a broad range. But I will say our core audience are definitely the people who are likely to vote in the Democratic primary, and LGBT issues are one of their, let's say, top 3 or core issues that are going to drive who they pick in that ballot.
And you were talking about this idea of the local, and I think so much gets passed over when, we've got to get, people to the polls for the presidential race and for Senate and for governor. And how do you encourage people, or why should they be going for these local elections?
Yeah, there's a couple of things. When you're talking at the state house, state Senate level, so much of the work on legislation that happens at the state level on everything from how much money does your local school get to minimum wage, to housing, to transportation. All of that work is done by a select few individuals that work on that legislation and serve on the committees in the 2 chambers. So people say, well, what difference does one state house member make? That one state house member could be the one that helps craft one piece of that changes hundreds, thousands of people's lives because of a couple of sentences. And I think that's really important people to understand. It's not that we're asking them to elect a state rep because that state rep is going to go on to be president or something. Like that's not that kind of like stage. The stage is about doing the hard work and the writing and the legislative, the true legislative side of these things that impact us day to day. When you take that down to even more local level, like a city council or mayor's race, that's even more local, right? That's about, is the pothole in front of your house getting fixed? And is this part of is this neighborhood getting the same services as this neighborhood? Are police actually like valuing LGBTQ when they're sorting for jail time? You know, it's all of these different things that may not seem like may not be at the forefront when you walk into a voting booth, but they matter all the way down. It's
secondary. It's not as flashy. It's not as exciting, but
and you know, one of the areas I've been really happy with Stonewall, not just because we've been able to point people to pro-LGBT candidates, but it's some of the candidates that search Stonewall out, especially when it comes for endorsement time every 2 to 4 years. The one that I've always been super impressed by is on the judicial side, which are technically nonpartisan races, but there are judges who want you to, or judges and even district attorneys and people that are in the legal system that want you to know that they are LGBT friendly. And they go both sides, obviously, because it's nonpartisan races for the most part. But just the fact that they're aware that communities are out there, everybody from family courts to superior courts to you name it, that's been a huge source of pride to me for the work that Stonewall's done.
Yeah, and I mean, politics are politics, and so people know, you know, where they should align. How often do you feel though that, like, wow, this candidate gets it, and they are like really here because this is important to them?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of ways to look at it. Probably the easiest way, and I'll apologize if this sounds a little simplistic, but there are kind of the passive LGBT friendly, where they're not necessarily going to go out of their way to, you know, propose legislation or resolutions or march or do activism side or even policy side. And then there's the active ones, and sometimes the active ones surprise you. You know, it could be a straight white male from North DeKalb that you would just never guess would be like one of the strongest LGBT allies, and they are.
Yeah.
Or it might be, you know, that new young state rep that is just grabbing the leadership role and including LGBT and everybody else and wrapping their arms around them and taking it with them. So those surprises definitely make it worth it, but we're just as happy for those that are more passive. You know, the numbers help, and they help advance causes.
So what legislation is currently happening at a local, state level that the Stonewall Democrats are following and are concerned about?
There's a couple that I know Stonewall is looking at, and some of these aren't new. The religious freedom movement that's happened in a lot of states is definitely of major concern. So that's one. The one that passed the General Assembly here a few years ago was vetoed by the governor. So we're thankful for that. And I don't think we would have some of the economic benefits, particularly from the movie industry, we would have now if that had passed. So that's one. And you think about, you know, the marriage ban and sort of the message that sent to particularly young LGBT folks in the state, and how harmful something like that could be if it happened again.
Right.
So keeping religious freedom, or RFRA, at bay is definitely of concern. And it is, I know it is one of the sorting mechanisms, let's say, sorting questions that Stonewall has for Democratic primary candidates. And I think for most, that's just such a non-issue. Most of them will say, no, we would never support it. But It is one of those things. In 2004, we didn't know, and now we still ask. And there are allied questions too, like the heartbeat bill that just passed and was signed here. Those questions are always part of the questionnaire as well. We do want to know where candidates stand on some of these very
Some that might not be right at the center of the LGBT community, but important and indicative of thoughts and feelings.
Correct.
So what is it that is important, and we touched on this just a little bit, about you being a partisan organization? So you've spoken to people from the New Georgia Project and from Galeo, and they're like, it's very important that we're nonpartisan, and and then talking like, that's got to be really hard to keep your own politics out, and they're like, here's why, here's how. You get to be partisan. And what are the pros and the cons of that, to be able to just be like, this is who I am and what I support?
I think the pro is that it is really easy to sort among people that like you and don't like you pretty quickly. I think sometimes, and I know this from my day-to-day work, which is completely balanced. In that aspect, it is very issue-driven. You have to go based upon the subject that's right in front of you, and not the partisan politics behind it. Whereas in Stonewall, you start from the partisan angle. So I think you sort of have a self-selection that happens right off the bat. We don't have Republicans that are going to come to Stonewall and ask for endorsement. It's just like you wouldn't have a Democrat going to the Republicans to ask for endorsement. So that is a lot different. And then the general, I think we would probably get asked about specific issues spot on. So rather than talking about sort of 10-mile high picture about affordable housing, ours is going to go down to, how do you include LGBTQ friendly policies in housing? We're drilling down a little bit more. Okay. And within that, we're still only talking within those that are voting in the Democratic primary. And I also probably should point out too, when I say that partisan, is that we do endorse in nonpartisan races if there's a clear delineation between candidates. Okay. And that goes back to that trying to be a good guide, where and I could use the Kasim Reed-Mary Norwood matchup again, that we wanted to make sure that people knew that there was a partisan difference between the two, even though they were in a nonpartisan race. Okay. They clearly and publicly aligned with one party over the other. Right.
So that wasn't a hard call to make.
No.
Is there work by your organization to get people registered to vote? Is that part of the package? I mean, I know it isn't, certainly not your main focus, but to tell people, if you want your rights represented, you should go and vote.
Yeah, and we have pretty much every year that I've been involved in Stonewall, the registration deadlines have always been part of the communication strategy. So if there's a municipal election that's happening in November of I'll use for example, of 2019 of this year, that those registration reminders would already be loaded and set to go. So not only do you have candidate information that's going out, but there's always registration reminders. And then we try to support any of our allied organizations, like some of the registration tables you mentioned. Those organizations, anytime they're doing drives, and if they ever ask us to pass on information, we're always happy to do it. The more people voting, the better.
So we have begun to hear more rhetoric at the national level, our current president, some members of Congress, even state politicians, that doing grassroots organizing is unpatriotic. Protesting against the government, even holding the government accountable, is somehow un-American. What is your response to that? I mean, you're chuckling now, but
yeah. I mean, it's a serious thing. I don't want to make light of it. It's just it seems like pretty much my whole life I've had that same kind of argument, right? About when I was growing up in church, it was you have to take the pastor's word. You don't speak against them, because that's not the right thing. That isn't what God would want. And I feel like when you move into politics, you get the same thing. If you speak out against a leader of your party, oh no, that's awful, you should never. And I think it depends on which angle you're doing it. I think from a Democratic Party perspective, when you have a bad actor or a bad apple, you need to call it what it is. And when you have somebody that has strayed, and I mean that and strayed politically, and maybe
there's a lot of religious language coming in here.
Yeah, you like that?
Strayed from the flock.
It's called bleeding in, yes. So yeah, when you have maybe somebody that just did either a bad quote, a bad vote, then I think it falls on us you want to point it out. You don't want to beat him over the head with it, but you want to point it out and try to get them to do better. Because I think in the end, that is kind of what everyone is striving for. If it's something egregious, then yes, you should speak out publicly and loudly on it.
Right.
But when you have somebody who's made a mistake, you try to get them to not make the mistake again. And that's sort of the nuance of politics that is kind of hard for non-politically active people to understand. But I think it doesn't matter if you're a parent or if you're a pet owner. Like you've had this before. You know when there's something bad that you really need to clamp down on,
right,
or speak out against, and there's some that are just one-offs or maybe mistakes, that
minor transgression, not
right, that need a pushback, and they don't do that again. And I think it is a hard line for any political organization and even the nonpartisan organizations to tread. You've got to know how and when that works. And when you're dealing with people, as leaders, that can be a difficult decision.
It's interesting you used a metaphor of children and animals.
It's just what came to my head. Sorry.
It was apt. No, I think it makes it clear for people. So what are the Stonewall Democrats' plans for the future?
I think we've been pretty adaptable. And I think right now, I shouldn't say right now, for the past few years, we've sort of tried not to duplicate what others are already doing. So when there's already great political activism, whether it's on a singular issue or on a wide, like on a statewide campaign or a national campaign, you try to foster that and just say, yes, go do that. Because we were all there one time too, right? And some of us still are, where you get on the bandwagon and you want to get politically involved. So we want to encourage that, but it's not really Stonewall's place to try to jump into the leadership role or jump into some kind of spot. It's not really where we are. Where I think Stonewall fits is still in that guiding post. And now, I mean, the great thing about 2019 from 2005 is that we're not sorting like 60% over here and 40% over there when we're sorting candidates. It's more like 98% over here and maybe 1 or 2%.
So that's encouraging. Here. That's a large pool to choose from.
It is, and you can call that whatever you want. I'll just say it's difference between 2005 and 2019, and we're really thankful for the political leadership that we see happening now in the Southeast.
So the whole premise of this project is that there were Democrats were in control, and then there was a move, and it was a two-party system, and now we might be seeing it swing back, possibly to two-party or back to Democratic control. Is it? I mean, do you see it possible? Is it possible for the state to ever be two-party imbalanced again? Or what are the advantages and disadvantages?
Yeah, I'm trying to think of a good example. I would say for the Southeast, it's not really written yet. There's not really I think Virginia might be about the closest you might see to that, as far as where the governorship seems to like to tip back and forth. And then I think even, wasn't there a state senate? They've had some changes where most of the others have just sort of flopped one way.
Right.
But what to me is really interesting is that as that parity, which went from Democrats being in control of every statewide office, of both chambers of the Georgia legislature, and then it tipped very rapidly, and it's been solid Republican across the board for many years now. But as that parity starts to get back closer and closer to a statewide majority on the Democratic side, things get louder, and elections get bigger, and issues get bigger, and personalities get bigger. And I know a lot of people get frustrated with that, because it's not really the calm that you get on an election when one party is in control. So I think for those that aren't politically active, that can get a little frustrating. But for those of us who are, it's super exciting.
Invigorating.
It is, and you get a lot of people that you didn't see. So you look at the recent past statewide campaigns. So many young political activists coming out of the woodwork to support candidates, and a lot of them stuck around. They're involved in organizations. They got involved in local community. They got involved in local Democratic Party. I think that's super encouraging to see.
Because they saw that impact that they had and how close.
Exactly.
How important is it not only for there to be candidates in office that support LGBTQ and allied rights, but for there to actually be LGBTQ people in office, right? So, I mean, it's one thing, like, in terms of African American and racial equalities, to have candidates that will espouse those values, but then to actually have those candidates in. So what is your thought on that?
Any person who has ever been elected to any office of any level, I think, would tell you that all of their work that they were or weren't able to do in that role is driven by relationships. How well other people know, how well other elected officials know them, how well they know other elected officials, and some of that's really personal, and some of it's just work colleague knowing. So if you think about like state legislature, you talk to any of the out members of the legislature in Georgia, I think they would absolutely agree that when you are on defense or offense on LGBT issues, those relationships with somebody across the aisle, inside your own party, from a totally different generation from you, like whatever that difference or divide is, having those personal conversations and personal relationships bridge those gaps. And so it doesn't matter what level of office or where on the ballot your office is, those relationships can make the difference on LGBT issues, or whether they even see the light of day, or whether they pass, or what they look like.
So what is your hope for Georgia and Georgia politics in the 2020 elections? And what about 10, 20 years from now?
What I would hope, and this is probably going to sound sacrilegious to some of my Democratic political activists, but what I hope is that we never get back to a place of complacency on one side of the party or the other. because what happens is you get kind of these shell shocked on one side, and you get people get really comfortable on the other side. And when that happens, political issues and policy work doesn't really get thought through much, honestly. So the more competitive elections that we have, the more that issues are being brought into mainstream talk on social media, kitchen tables.
Everyone has to stay on their toes.
Exactly. And the more that it's hard to let an important issue hide, where I think when you're in kind of a place of complete calm during an election or complete rule by one party over the other, a lot of those issues would just never see the light of day.
And then last question here to wrap up. Someone's watching this in the archive 20 years from now. What would you want them to know and understand about this political moment in Georgia's history, or your particular work? Or this is a catch-all answer, your last word.
Just that everything that has happened in Georgia when we've had political movements have always been because there was a small group of dedicated, loving, and very proud people that just keep working no matter what. And that regardless of how the winds blow, there is always that group of people that keeps working, and to acknowledge and respect that no matter which side of the aisle you're on, I think is important. It's acknowledging history, but also acknowledging how things have to get done.
All right. Well, Tim Cairl, thank you so much for taking the time to sit down with us today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.